Hi, friends. The purpose of this video is to provide a little background and context for two documents that we're going to study in class, the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution, specifically the Bill of Rights. So I just want to kind of try to understand who those people are who are writing that and why they're writing it and what the situation was that motivated them. So some of this story is going to be familiar from fifth grade and some of it might be new, fifth grade, eighth grade, when you studied these things. So you probably remember that there were 13 colonies in what we now call the United States to start with. There have been, colonists, people who are trying to take over, coming from the Netherlands, coming from Germany, coming from France, coming from England, coming from Spain. But by the time that the Revolutionary War was about to happen, there were 13 British-controlled colonies on the coast of what we now call the United States. And you might remember some of the things that were making them angry with their relationship with England. So something that you might remember is what's called the Stamp Act. And this is the idea of taxation without representation. Let's go back to the first picture for a second. Each of these colonies had their own colonial government, separate colonial government, and each of them was the property of the King of England. So England, by this time, as we know, had become a democracy and was really controlled by Parliament. However, the colonies were controlled directly by the English king, were his personal property. And he allowed for them to have these individual governments that they set up. But they saw themselves as independent, and the king did not. So why does a king allow people to create colonies in his name? You'll notice Georgia is named after King George, the king at the time of the Declaration of Independence. Why does a king allow his colonies to exist, create them? Because he wants to make money. That's the whole idea here. So the colonies were supposed to send money back home. What was actually going on, however, is that the colonies were constantly at war with the Native Americans, the indigenous people who already lived on this continent when the English came. And those wars were getting more and more expensive. Right before the time period we're talking about, the French and Indian War cost the British government so much money that the government was getting really frustrated, wanted to figure out a way to make the colonies pay for these war expenses themselves. So King George created a bunch of new taxes. You can see the stamp here says George Rex. So it's King George. One of those taxes was on paper, not on stamps, on paper. The idea was that paper was hard to make and came from England, and King George could charge the colonists to buy it, and then he would know whether or not they'd paid the tax because each piece of paper would have this kind of stamp on it. So the Stamp Act was about a tax on paper. But the king also taxed a bunch of other things the colonists couldn't be without, like sugar and tea, things that they only got from England and that they wanted and needed desperately. So they couldn't avoid paying these taxes if they wanted those things. That was the idea. And then King George was going to make his money back and cover all of his costs for all these wars with Native Americans. In fact, he tried to double down on that and say that the soldiers that he sent to the United States, then the colonies, for the purpose of protecting them, he wanted the colonists themselves to put those soldiers up in their homes and feed them for free so that the cost to the crown, to the king, would be lower. This made people really mad. And then you probably remember that some of that anger spilled over, that anger at King George spilled over into things like the Boston Tea Party, which is pictured here, drawn here, a completely ridiculous event in which a bunch of colonists got drunk, dressed up as Native Americans for reasons that don't make any sense, and then took the taxed tea and dumped it in the ocean because that's what you do with things you don't want to pay taxes on, is dump it in the ocean. You can see the silliness of this whole event, but it was a way that they could show anger, so they did. Yeah, not a very constructive way, but a way. The tension continued to increase, especially in places like Boston, and you probably heard about the Boston Massacre, a massacre in which something on the order of about 7 people were killed by British soldiers in a little contretemps that happened. Basically, as far as we can tell, there were soldiers walking around, there were angry colonists walking around, a little back and forth got started, which involved some snowballs. Somebody said something that sounded like the word fire, and before you know it, 7 people were dead, including Crispus Attucks, an African American. So those are the stories that you probably remember from 5th and 8th grade, but I actually want to recall a couple of other things that are often not told to you when you're younger. One of the things is that in order to stop the colonies from getting into all these fights with indigenous Native American people, King George had drawn this line, which you see on the map, the red line. He called it the Proclamation Line of 1763. And the proclamation was that the colonists needed to stay on this side of the line, that King George was done fighting with Native Americans. They could have this part of the United States, and he would only protect the colonists to the extent that they stayed on their side of the line. The colonists did not like this idea. They wanted to move into Indian territory and take over more land. They were pissed at King George for failing to, in their mind, defend them and protect them in their desire to expand and get rid of more Native Americans and take more Native American land. Another thing that's going on is that the colonists want to do business with other countries besides England. So part of this issue with the taxes is that instead of getting their paper and tea and whatever else from England, the colonists would like to start buying it from the Netherlands, from other places in the world at cheaper prices. And they're upset about having to buy from the king. So it was an economic war. It was a race war about the desire to take over and take over more land from the Indians, and it was a war about taxation. So what's the without representation part? The without representation part is that the colonists knew that back at home in England, people got to participate in the decisions through Parliament, and that Parliament had control over the king, whereas their little colonial governments had no control over the king and couldn't tell him what to do. So the representation part is that they desired to have more of a representative system of government and to have the king take a step back the same way that the king had been forced to take a step back at home. So all of this leads to a war which was declared, which was embarked upon by the colonists with the Declaration of Independence. And this is a painting of the Declaration of Independence signing. So they got together and made a long list of all their beefs with King George. And to be honest, it's the whiniest, most complaining document you've ever read in your life. It just lists all the things that they hate King George and all the times that they tried to reach out to him and talk to him and he would ignore them. It goes on and on and on like this. But in the opening lines of their document, they explained why they felt that they had the right to rebel against their own government, against the king. And that statement about what government is supposed to do and what gives people the right to rebel reverberated around the world and continues to inspire people around the world to take up arms in their own defense, to think about what they want and how they want to get it from government, even if it means revolution. So that's why we're going to study it. I did just want to point out that that document was basically an act of war, an act of treason against the King of England. And so initially it was a very dangerous thing to sign. This painting, when it was first made, only included some people because a lot of the folks who actually signed the Declaration of Independence did not want to be pictured. They were afraid that someday it was going to come back and haunt them and they would be hanged for treason. After the war was over and England had lost the war, the painting was redone and all these faces were added because everyone was like, yeah, I was there. I signed it. I was down for the fight. But maybe they weren't quite so sure at the time. So after the Declaration of Independence, there was a war which took a couple of years to prosecute and was exceedingly messy. And when the war was over, the United States colonists had the home court advantage, you might say, from a military point of view. When the war was over and England had to leave, they went back to being 13 independent colonies. They did not want to be one nation. They signed a sort of tentative little agreement that allowed them to communicate between each other, but they really didn't want to have a central government that ran them all together. They wanted to be 13 independent nations. So they tried that for about 10 years, and it was a mess. They were trying to tax each other for trade across each other's borders. There were rebellions among the people of the various colonies that couldn't be put down because the armies of each individual colony were too weak to do so. And finally, they realized that they needed to put in together and create a central government that could be stronger and more effective. So they borrowed some ideas from the Iroquois, which you've read about now, about how to create independent states that are also part of a strong central organization. And that federal system is what they codified in the US Constitution about 10 years after the end of the Revolutionary War. So you probably recognize the first words of the US Constitution, "We the people." What you might know is that the Constitution that these colonists designed was designed to keep the federal government as weak as possible. Because they were really not wanting to have a central federal government, they sat down and wrote one that was a little bit more powerful than nothing at all, but not very powerful. For one thing, they made it so that the national government only had some power, and the states retained a lot of individual power. That's called a federation. And even at a local level, governments have power that the states can't take away. States have power that the national government can't take away. This makes the national government relatively weak compared to other governments around the world. And to further weaken that national government, they made it have three branches that have equal and opposing powers and the ability to stop each other from doing things. So the legislative branch, which we know as Congress, can make laws, but they have to be enforced by the executive branch. That's the office of the president and all of the various departments. And they can be interpreted by the judges. That would be, in this case, the Supreme Court and all the other judicial institutions within the government. And so each one of these can stop each other from doing anything that they think is wrong. And you've probably seen examples of this recently, right? The courts will stop the president from doing something. The courts will tell Congress they can't do something. Congress will tell the president he can't do something. The president will tell Congress that they can't do something, that he won't sign something that they wrote, that he won't implement something that they set out. So the idea was intentional to create a weak central government that would only progress as long as there was near consensus, as long as everyone could generally agree on where things were supposed to go. And so if that seems frustrating and annoying and like it does very little, that is what the Constitution was designed to do. But the most interesting part of the Constitution is the first 10 amendments, because even with all these controls, the writers of the Constitution were so afraid that they were creating a strong central government that might begin to act like a king. They were so afraid of this that they decided to write 10 additional amendments that limited the power of government over people and to define some rights and freedoms that the government could never take away. The first 10 amendments of the Constitution became part of the Constitution at its signing. And they were changes to the Constitution, but the Constitution couldn't be signed until those changes had been signed. And so those amendments, those very first amendments that were made right at the same time that the Constitution was finished, represent this idea of individual freedom that government can never take away and a sort of backstop against a potentially powerful central government that they were afraid they were creating. So we want to study some of those and talk a little bit about those. And again, our interest here in a world history course is to find out what these documents do so that when we see them being interpreted and applied and borrowed from or borrowed against and in other places in the world, we can recognize what's going on there. So I look forward to talking about that in class. Talk to you soon.